Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. We're joined by a wonderful expert that's going to share with us ways that we can heal naturally if you're a particular person who's in recovery from heart attacks, heart surgery, or other cardiac episodes. And if you're not, but you want to get out of your sedentary lifestyle and you want to build the strength in that heart, certainly what we're going to share with you today is going to be exciting and definitely mind-opening. We're going to be joined with Mr. Keith Burns, who has served in the exercise science field as a strength and conditioning coach at the collegiate and professional level. Currently, he works as a tenured track instructor of exercise science at Raritan Valley Community College. And we're joined today with the newest book, Exercises for Cardiac Recovery. I'd like to welcome to the program our guest, Mr. Keith Burns. Keith, thank you for being on the program today.
Daniel, thank you for having me.
Now, what took you down this path where you became really interested in matters of the heart, so to speak?
I would say, growing up, I was always an athlete. I was a track and field athlete, so I was always involved with the cardiovascular side of the equation, and that kind of led me into the exercise science world on the academic side, where I got to study exercise physiology, cardiac rehab, EKG interpretation, along with methods and for assessing individuals and also training individuals to make them not only healthier but also to increase their overall performance. And we can define performance as either athletic performance or just performance in life. I think more people would agree with that. And then from there, I basically had a wonderful position working at the Princeton Longevity Center, where I was able to assess over 2,000 individuals via EKG stress test, VO2, which is your body's ability to utilize oxygen. And from that, putting all facets of my career together, kind of really went into developing this book.
One of the things that I noticed when I was reading this is that it seems that you take a lot of mystery out of there versus, let's say, in the medical community where they tend to, as a lot of things, kind of put fear and almost a feeling of hopelessness, that when you're moving toward a particular direction where your heart may not be healthy, well, you're kind of looking at the end of the line, but you actually, in this book, Cardiac Recovery, give people, in my opinion, a feeling of not only encouragement, but that there's a lot of resilience when it comes to rebuilding the heart, so to speak, especially if you do it naturally, as you're talking about here. What has been your experience?
I think, if we look at the human body, it's really the only machine that breaks down when it's not being used. So we know that cardiac events are not usually single events or things that happen over a long period of times, and we don't really even realize what's happening until the event actually happens. So we want to basically develop a book that, like you said, takes away some of the myths and misconceptions about exercise, and also from a post rehab recovery aspect. The heart has to be strong in order to maintain life. And if we do nothing, the heart muscle actually decreases in strength, decreases in efficiency, which is one of the reasons why people do have, our mortality rate, basically increases, with the more sedentary activity or the more sedentary an actual individual is. So we want to really take that aspect and say, okay, you know what? We should be active, we should be moving, we should be exercising, but how do we do it properly? And I think that's really what we're trying to really hone in on with this actual book.
Now, that's one of the biggest things that glared at me was the idea that, movement is actually the best medicine. Get up and just, take action, so to speak. And I thought about that, and I thought, I was in an industry for a lot of years in hospitality where you're constantly walking and moving. In fact, there was one point where I was actually working in a place where we had 3 levels of stairs to get up to the kitchen. So you imagine doing that all day long.
Absolutely.
And that was in my 30s and 40s, I was thinking. And then, I realized that on top of that, too, that I bicycle usually to and from work. Sometimes I'll cheat a little bit and I would throw it on a bus or whatever, but I was using it especially coming home. And I realize that, just walking quite a bit, I think is pretty excellent. And again, when you share the exercises you do in here, you're not talking about anything really super strenuous, are you?
It doesn't have to be. I think the goal as a practitioner is really to meet the individual where they're at, and that's going to be, from a physical standpoint. So, what's the person's, what are they starting from? Are they at point A or at point B, point D, E, F, whatever it might be, and really progress them from that point going forward. And I think we also have to look at the emotional side and the psychological side of things too, and again, try to meet the individual where they're at. So it's a holistic approach. It's not just, doing things that are super intense or doing things, and it can be things that are super low intensity as well if there's enough volume. But again, it goes back to the individual and really meeting them where they're at. And that could be, again, it could be walking, it could be biking, it could be gardening, landscaping, or it could be a little bit more of a structured physical activity like going to the gym, or maybe going out for a run, like you mentioned before, as far as, bicycling. So it's really, again, it goes back to the individual, find out where they're at, what they're currently doing, and then try to progress them going forward.
Now, let's go ahead and talk about briefly how people can assess risk factors. As I was reading some of those in your book, I realized, they're not as complicated or, out there as you tend to think. You hear a lot about blood pressure and things like that. But let's go ahead and see if we can clear up a few things that perhaps are being communicated out there that may not be entirely true.
Yeah, so, I think if we look at the basic risk factors, we can look at them and say, okay, some are modifiable and some are not, right? So if we look at, family history, if there's a family history, obviously that's a non-modifiable risk factor. But usually that's not to me, that unless it's a clear-cut case of family history where it's been passed down from generation to generation, oftentimes, we don't also know what people that lived before us, from our family side of the equation, what was their lifestyle, how did they live. So often things are really, disease manifests truly from lifestyle, and there's also a little bit of a genetic component. So family history is a big one, and again, that's non-modifiable. We can't change our parents, we can't change our grandparents. But we can change things that, like smoking, so are you a current smoker, or have you smoked within the last 6 months? That's basically considered, a risk factor. But going forward, that's a modifiable one. We can look at hypertension or blood pressure, and these are things we can easily get. You can go out to your local pharmacy. They often have blood pressure machines there, and they're fairly accurate. But most people go for a yearly physical. If they're not, then they should be. And those are numbers we can get there as well. You might be able to get those numbers during a health or wellness fair in your local community. We could also look at, cholesterol. We could look at glucose levels. But really, to me, when I look at the risk factors, one of the biggest ones I really look at is obesity. What is the person's body mass index, which is basically their height to weight ratio, or if you could actually have someone analyze your actual body fat percentage, that might be a better indicator. But obesity, has a tendency to lead to the other factors. So, for instance, someone who's obese generally has a higher blood pressure. Someone who's obese generally has higher levels of cholesterol and triglycerides. So these are things, again, if we can modify that basic risk factor of obesity, it may have positive impacts all the way through the other risk factors. And I think that's something that we don't really focus in on as much as we probably should.
I know one of the other ones, too, that you hear a lot about is cholesterol in the heart. What about that one there?
So cholesterol, and that's kind of a unique one, because we've always associated cholesterol with heart disease and plaque. And I think some of the newer research that we're really starting to hone in on is, potentially, is there inflammation that's happening within the arteries first that then causes plaque to build up? So if you look at the actual buildup of plaque, it basically contains cholesterol particles. So if we look at that and say, okay, well, it's cholesterol that's causing that, but is there something else that's actually causing inflammation or a narrowing of the artery? So I try to teach this to my students that if you have a pipe that's supposed to be, 6 inches in diameter and we shrink that down to 4, what happens to the pressure that's being exerted inside the pipe what happens to the actual flow of the medium that's supposed to be going through there. So I think we're starting to see the same thing when it comes to cholesterol and heart disease, that it may not be the actual cause of the buildup of plaque, it's just a byproduct of it. And that's something I had learned in my 4 years over at the Princeton Longevity Center when we had done heart scans on people. We looked for early onset of plaque before it actually showed up in other diagnostics. So I think cholesterol is I think we're seeing better information on it now than we have in the past, but I don't always think it's a direct cause of the actual plaque buildup.
But that is reversible, though, isn't it?
To some degree, it is. Yeah, I mean, we can, there's some studies that are showing that if there's a little bit of a buildup, it's potentially reversible. It's not set in stone though at this point in time. And now, as far as lowering our total cholesterol, we could do that through lifestyle. So we know that exercise actually decreases the LDL, which is your low density cholesterol, which is the bad one. It also raises the HDL, which is the high density proteins. Those are considered good and actually have a heart protective mechanism to them. So we know exercise is good for that. And if it doesn't come down, then there are potential other things to do. And I don't want to go into medication because I think medication is really sort of the last stage before other means have been exhausted. But if we had to go that route, we could actually take that down as well. But I think exercise is sort of the first line of defense.
Well, absolutely. Keep yourself moving. Quit sitting around like a lot of people tend to be doing this day and age.
Absolutely.
Now, let's talk about how people can go about testing for cardiovascular health. Yeah,
so there's a ton of easy to do tests, right? So we can look at basically, if you want to look at some basic field tests to put it lightly, people think that testing always has to be done within a laboratory, but it doesn't. We have plenty of tests that they can do. There's some easy tests they can look at. There's a Rockport 1 mile walking test where we basically look at how fast somebody can actually walk the mile, and that goes into an equation, and we can look at that along with their heart rate at the end of the 1 mile. So the goal with that test is basically to complete the mile in as fast a time as possible, but also assess the heart rate. So if someone completes it very quickly, and again, it's a walking test, it's not a running test, so it can be done by anybody who's able to walk. If they can complete that test very quickly and their heart rate remains low, that's a pretty good indicator that they're in at least a baseline stage of cardiovascular health. And then from there, we could tier that up into, basically we could do a 1.5 mile walk/run. And again, we look at how fast the person can complete that. All these tests go back to estimating what we call VO2 max, which is basically the amount of oxygen the heart can actually deliver to the body and the body can actually utilize. And that's a marker for health.
Wow, very encouraging stuff that we're talking about here today as we're talking about exercises for cardiac recovery. Now, when people want to embark on this journey, obviously, as I was looking at some of the exercises in this book, you start out kind of slowly, and you're looking at resistance. Let's talk about how a person should start, because a lot of times people get excited about changes, and especially in directions of improving their lives, and they think, well, more is better, but that ain't necessarily true, is it?
It's not, absolutely not. So again, if someone had a really good base going into a program, obviously their progression rate is going to be greater. But most of the people, specifically what this book was really designed for, is someone who's been sedentary, someone who's had potentially some sort of cardiovascular event. And where do we start, right? And really the thing is to start slow. It's a slow and steady race. It's not a sprint. It's truly a marathon. And the goal is that, if we can get someone up to basic levels of physical activity, which is basically about 150 minutes per week. So if we think about that spread out over the course of, 7 days within a week, it's really not that long of an activity. We're talking, 20 plus minutes, just a little over 20 minutes. And it could be something that's, again, as simple as walking. And then we could also go into the point where we can actually begin resistance training. And resistance training, and for lack of better terms, we use the term, weight training. But resistance training could be anything that provides resistance into the body. It could be body weight exercises such as push-ups, pull-ups, things like that. So things that may be more accessible to somebody. So it's not always something where you have to go to a gym. You should be able to do most of these basic exercises at home. And then from there, again, it's starting slow and progressing slowly, but in a sustainable manner.
Well, one thing too is just walk up and down stairs or a hill.
Absolutely. You know, so, and I think that's the other thing. I think you know, we get a lot of people that feel, and I would say it's probably geographically driven based on the time of year. But you know, here in the Northeast, you know, today it's in the 20s. We're expecting some winter weather this evening. You may not want to be outside walking. So, do you have access to things at home? And like you said, up and down stairs. So, do you have a set of stairs in your house, or even just one step? You know, where you could just do what they call a step-up test, or just a step-up exercises where you just keep repeating that one step. You know, so right leg up, right leg down, and just repeat that. And it's actually an assessment as well. We actually utilize that with our students. It's called a 3-minute step test, and we do the same thing. We do a step test, and then we measure heart rate and then recovery of the heart rate within a certain amount of time. But that could also be an exercise for most people. Like you said before, you were climbing stairs going up to the kitchen. You know, what's the heart rate response to that? So I think, you know, so anything that gets the heart rate up, it doesn't have to be anything super technological. It doesn't have to be anything outside of your own house or office. You know, we have plenty of people that, you know, utilize these programs within an office environment and have great success.
Mm-hmm. You know, I was thinking about that, too, when you talk about getting your heart rate up, and there's something to be said, too, about getting to a point that, like you were talking about, walking the mile quickly. I remember when I used to work out at a gym on an exercise bike, and he says, you want to go ahead and bring the level up to this point here and maintain it. You know, for 30 minutes. And then I found eventually that I was doing up to, 3 to 5 miles a day after a while with, to where my heart rate was just kind of, it was easy going, so to speak.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the body responds pretty quickly for most people. Now, obviously, someone who's in a post-cardiac event, obviously the progression might be a little bit slower, but the goal is always to progress. So if we think of the heart, we have to think of it as a muscle. And just like your biceps, if you want your biceps to get stronger, eventually you have to add more resistance to the exercises that are working that muscle. And the same has to be said for the heart. I think the older picture was that, we set it at a very low intensity and we just increased the time, and that's one way to get there. But I think at the same time, with the newer research on intervals and things like that, we know that those spikes of intensity are actually really good for the heart because they provide a little bit more overload to the actual cardiac muscle, and then the muscle responds by getting stronger. Heart gets more stronger, basically becomes more efficient. So I think, and that should be the goal. I think we have to look at it from a holistic approach and not just look at the overall distance, but also increases of intensity. How we get there might be different for each individual, though.
Now, you also talk about what's known as an intensity spectrum. What exactly is that?
Yeah, so the intensity spectrum is basically based off of the person's age-predicted maximum heart rate. So what is the maximum heart rate that the individual could essentially drive their heart rate up to, where it would actually plateau? And obviously that would be considered maximal effort. So the range is anywhere from as low of about 30-35% upwards into the 85-90% range, based on the individual, where they're at, what type of health they're in. So the goal would be to progressively increase the intensity over time, so that maybe within the first 2 or 3 weeks you're at a lower intensity. So say we start someone at 30 or 35% of maximum heart rate for the first 2 weeks, and the goal would be to gradually increase that. And we know that, again, because that percent intensity overloads the heart, makes the heart more stronger, makes it much more efficient. And essentially, as the heart becomes more efficient, it supplies the body with more nutrients and oxygen with less beats per minute. So we can look at it from an energy expenditure that way as well.
Now, one of what I noticed also in your book, too, is, and it's something I haven't seen too often in exercise books, if you will, but that you have a large ball, so that some of these exercises, such as, dumbbell presses and so forth, are done while you're sitting on a large ball. What's with the ball?
So the ball is basically, again, so it's some people will call it a Swiss ball, some people will call it a physio ball. We have a term that we use, we basically call it a physio ball. But the physio ball provides a little bit. It's twofold, right? So if you want to do a certain exercise where like a let's say like a dumbbell chest press where you're traditionally you're lying down on a bench and then you're pressing the weight up. Not everyone has access to that, or maybe wants to buy that, but you could actually go out and buy a physio ball for relatively inexpensive, probably anywhere between $15 to $25 based on where you're at in the country and what market you go to. But that provides, obviously, it works as a bench, so you can actually use that as well. It also provides a little bit of instability, which we know that instability helps to integrate more core musculature. So we could talk about low back into the hips, abdominals. So for the general population, that might be a really great way to also increase balance and posture over the course of time.
Now, what are some of the things that you really enjoy doing?
As far as personal working out?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I'm a traditional strength and conditioning guy. So I love being in the weight room. Anything that involves a barbell, a dumbbell, a kettlebell, that's sort of my bread and butter when it comes to me. Personally, from a cardiovascular perspective, having the track and field background, obviously running when I get the opportunity to do that. And I do like intensity, so I have a tendency to really push. And I, actually, as I've gotten older, I felt the need to actually push even more, because one of the things we see is that as we age, I think that the myth and misconception, and we talked about this a little bit earlier, dispelling some of these things, is that we should lift lighter, right, with less weight and more repetitions. But what we know what happens is that we don't actually stimulate some of the stronger muscle fibers that we need to stimulate as we age. And I'm at the point now where I'm basically trying to set myself up physically for the second half of my existence here on Earth. So I want to really, try to push the envelope forward and maintain muscle mass and strength and power as I go forward. And that's something we're actually starting to really utilize. We even with sort of I would say an active adult population, we're seeing really good results by doing those things. So that's kind of where I'm at. I'm also trying to get a little bit into the mind-body stuff as well, a little bit more into the yoga, meditation, and Pilates realm as well.
Well, it's all very exciting, and I noticed, as I said, your book tends to lend more encouragement and hope than actually despair. Like you're not looking at this in a way that you say, well, your lifestyle is this, but, when you consider turning this around, you're going to find the heart as well as the rest of the body is going to become very resilient. As you said, the more you're using it in activity, the better off you're going to be in the long run.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the other thing I would say, too, is that, from a holistic perspective, looking at how the body moves in general and making it more efficient. If the individual is a little bit stronger from the muscular side of things, that actually takes some stress off the heart during normal daily activity. So if they're a little bit stronger in their legs, climbing a set of stairs becomes a little bit more efficient, which takes some of the strain off the heart. So overall, if we look at total strain on the heart throughout the day, it probably actually decreases by doing that. So again, holistically, we have to consider all options.
Now, how can people find out a place where they can get the book, things like that?
Yeah, so Amazon is sort of the main supplier for the book. I know, so that's an easy one for most people. Also, Barnes & Noble carries it as well, and I would say those are probably the two main areas where they could actually purchase the book from.
Well, very good. I want to thank you for sharing this book with our listeners here today. Like I said, very exciting stuff. The book is Exercises for Cardiac Recovery. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today, our guest, Keith Burns. Thank you for being on the program today, Keith.
Oh, thank you. I appreciate it.
You bet. We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for joining us. You can also discover more at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming shows. I want to thank you for tuning in. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis, and remember, live your day past halfway.